He trained his dog for months, conditioned it to attack on command, planned every detail down to the second. Then he pointed at a royal guard and whispered 2 words, "Take him." What happened next? The dog lunged but didn't strike, and the reason why will change how you see these ceremonial soldiers forever. Before we reveal what stopped that attack, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. Now let's get into it. The morning. Drizzle hadn't quite decided whether it wanted to be rain yet. That soft London mist that makes tourists check their weather apps twice, wondering if they should risk leaving the umbrella at the hotel. The kind of weather that makes the ancient stones around Buckingham Palace gleam like they've been polished, reflecting the gray sky in pools of silver light. Lance Corporal Daniel Frutt didn't check weather apps. Hadn't in years. He stood at his ceremonial post near the Victoria Memorial, rain beating on his black buckskin hat and running in perfect lines down the brass buttons of his red Coldstream Guard's tunic. His rifle rested grounded against the wet cobblestones, shoulders back, chin level, eyes fixed on that invisible point all guards learned to focus on during their first week of training. To the tourists gathering behind the rope barriers, he looked exactly like every other guard they'd seen in postcard, stoic, silent, unmoving. A living statue in an ancient tradition that somehow still commanded respect in a world of smartphones and social media. But here's what those tourists didn't know about the man standing so perfectly still in the drizzle. Frutt had done 3 tours in Afghanistan. Not behind a desk, not in a supply depot, but forward operating bases where silence meant survival and stillness could be the difference between coming home and not. He trained military working dogs, German Shepherds, Belgian Malinois breeds, that could detect explosives from 50 meters or track insurgents across rocky terrain that would break a man's ankle. Most importantly, he knew how to read animals, their posture, their breathing, the subtle shift in weight that meant they were about to move. It was a skill that had kept him alive in Helmand Province, where he'd worked with a German shepherd named Brix, who could detect IEDs buried 3 feet underground and sense hostile intent from 100 meters away. Brix had saved his unit more times than Frutt could count. The dog had an almost supernatural ability to read human emotions, could tell the difference between a nervous farmer and a nervous insurgent just by watching how they held themselves. Their shoulders. Frutt had learned to trust that instinct completely, even when it contradicted intelligence reports or battlefield assessments. The dog had died on their final patrol together. Stepping on a pressure plate meant for Frutt. The explosion had been instantaneous, merciful in its speed, but the guilt had followed Frutt home and never quite left. Maybe that's why he'd volunteered for ceremonial duty afterwards, somewhere he could serve without putting another partner at risk. That's why, at exactly 8:40 to that morning, something about the man with the dog caught his attention. The guy was standing alone near the southeast rope line, half hidden behind one of those ornate lamp posts that dot the palace perimeter. Mid-40s, probably. Black canvas jacket with the hood down despite the mist, sunglasses, which seemed odd given the overcast sky. But it wasn't the man that made Frutt's trained instincts start humming. It was the dog, a Belgian Malinois pure muscle, wrapped in tan and black fur, sitting perfectly still beside his handler, not sniffing around like most dogs brought to the palace gates, not distracted by the crowd or the pigeons or the dozen different scents that would normally drive a dog crazy with curiosity, just watching, focused, alert in a way that reminded Frutt uncomfortably of the working dogs he'd known downrange. The Malinois had that particular stillness that comes from training, not the relaxed calm of a family pet, but the coiled readiness of an animal waiting for orders. His ears were forward, neck slightly extended, weight shifted onto his front paws in a stance for recognized immediately attack position. Frutt allowed himself one slow blink, then let his gaze drift back to that fixed point ahead, but his peripheral vision stayed locked on the man and dog. The leash was short and taut, but the animal wasn't straining against it. He was simply ready. A camera flashed to Frutt's left. A child somewhere behind him said something about the funny hat in that piercing voice kids use when they think whispers are the same as shouting. Tour groups moved past in the eternal rhythm of London tourism, Japanese businessmen checking their watches, American families debating lunch plans, elderly couples walking arm in arm under shared umbrellas. Normal routine. Exactly the kind of controlled chaos that makes palace security guards sleep well at night. Except for the man with the sunglasses whose hand had just moved inside his jacket. Not digging around, not searching for something, just resting there. Fingers wrapped around what looked like a small device, like someone holding a trigger. and waiting for the right moment to pull it. The dog's breathing had changed to shorter, more controlled, the kind of respiratory pattern Fred had seen in working dogs just before they were released to engage a target. A shift change would begin. In 8 minutes, that's when crowd density usually peaked. More noise, more movement, more opportunities for someone to create chaos while security was transitioning between posts. Fred's right boot shifted half an inch against the wet stone. Not enough for tourists to notice, but enough to rebalance his stance, enough to prepare for movement if movement became necessary. Behind those mirrored sunglasses, the man was watching him, and the dog hadn't blinked in over 30 seconds. 6 years. That's how long Kieran Locke had spent in HMP Singley. And not once during those 72 months had he stopped thinking about this moment. Not about redemption or rehabilitation or any of the other words the prison counselors like to throw round. About this standing outside Buckingham Palace with a weapon nobody would recognize until it was too late. His first month inside, he'd paced his cell like a caged animal. Not from guilt. He'd never felt an ounce of that for clocking the military police officer who'd arrested him during that protest in Manchester. The bastard had it coming, standing there in his pressed uniform thinking his badge made him untouchable. But the ease with which they'd taken him down afterward, that still burned. 3 officers, professional, efficient, utterly unbothered by his rage. They'd handled him like he was nothing more than paperwork with legs. No emotion, no acknowledgement that he'd landed a solid hit on one of their own. Just calm, systematic processing. That's when he had understood the real problem. It wasn't individual cops or soldiers. It was the system itself, the quiet confidence, the unshakable belief that their authority meant something. The way they could stand perfectly still and somehow make everyone around them feel smaller. Like those guards at Buckingham Palace. Motionless statues in fancy dress that tourists photographed and children pointed at with awe. Props in a fairy tale about tradition and honor that convinced millions of people to respect something that was really just theater. But what if someone could prove it was all an act? The idea had come from his cellmate, former Private Marcus Webb, who'd washed out of infantry training after 6 weeks and spent the next 2 years telling anyone who'd listen that the military was full of frauds and pretenders. Webb had mentioned the working dog program. Once how certain breeds could be trained to target specific types of movement, or in this case, the lack of it. These ceremonial guards, Webb had said during one of their late-night conversations, they're trained not to react. What happens when something comes at them that doesn't care about their training? Kieran had remembered that conversation every day for the next 5 years. Finding Victor hadn't been easy. Military working dogs don't show up in newspaper classified ads, and the kind of people who deal in stolen service animals aren't exactly advertising on Facebook. But prison teaches you patience, and patience had eventually led him to a grimy kennel outside Doncaster, where a man with prison tattoos and nervous eyes had shown him a Belgian Malinois, with scars on his flanks and absolutely no paperwork. 6,000, the man had said. Cash, and you better know what you're doing, because this one's had professional training. Kieran had smiled for the first time in months. Perfect. The training had taken 8 months, not in public parks where people might ask questions, but in abandoned warehouses and empty fields after midnight. Victor learned to associate stillness with aggression, silence with threat. A closed fist meant watch and wait. An open palm meant freeze. A single finger snap meant prepare. And the whispered command take him meant attack, whatever wasn't moving fast enough to defend itself. The beauty of the plan was its simplicity. Guards weren't allowed to break formation. They stood still because that was their job, their identity, their whole reason for existing. And Victor had been conditioned to see that stillness as a target. One attack, 30 seconds of chaos. A guard humiliated on camera, while tourists screamed and security scrambled to respond. The video would spread faster than wildfire. Proof that these ceremonial soldiers were nothing more than window dressing brought down by a single dog who knew what they really were. Nobody would get seriously hurt. Victor was trained for takedowns, not kills. But the message would be unmistakable. Your untouchable guards aren't so untouchable after all. Now, standing in the morning drizzle with his thumb resting on the concealed training clicker, Kieran watched the soldier and felt that familiar surge of anticipation. The guard was young, maybe early 30s, clean-shaven, perfectly postured, eyes fixed straight ahead in that trademark 1,000-yard stare. A perfect target. Kieran leaned down slightly, close enough to Victor's ear that his words would carry over the ambient noise of the crowd. Take him. His thumb pressed the clicker. Victor surged forward like a released spring. But what happened next wasn't what Kieran had spent 8 months training for. The leash snapped to its full length, then went slack as the quick-release mechanism. Kieran had practiced dozens of times, worked exactly as intended. Victor hit the wet cobblestones with his claws extended, powerful hindquarters driving him forward in the kind of explosive acceleration that makes Belgian Malinois the preferred breed for military and police work worldwide. Kieran's chest swelled with satisfaction. This was it. This was the moment 6 years of planning and 8 months of training had been building toward. The crowd saw it immediately. A woman screamed. Someone dropped their phone. Parents instinctively stepped in front of their children, and the general murmur of tourist conversation cut off like someone had flipped a switch. Victor covered the distance to the guard in less than 3 seconds, his body a blur of muscle and trained aggression aimed directly at the motionless figure in the red tunic. But as he closed the final few feet, something changed. The scent hit him first, not fear or aggression, but something else, and something familiar, buried beneath the wool and brass and leather of the ceremonial uniform. The smell of confidence without hostility, of watchfulness without threat. It was a scent Victor remembered from before, from the handlers who'd worked with him during his early training, when commands came with praise instead of punishment, when success meant treats and approval instead of avoiding pain. His stride faltered, not stumbled. Victor was too well trained for that, but shifted as conflicting impulses warred in his mind. Kieran's conditioning screamed at him to continue the attack, but deeper instincts, older memories, whispered something different. This wasn't just a target in a red coat. This was something else. His head tilted slightly, ears adjusting to pick up some signal Kieran couldn't identify. The guard's breathing was controlled, steady, not the rapid, shallow pattern of fear that Victor had been taught to exploit. And his posture, while rigid, didn't carry the tension of someone preparing to fight or flee. Instead, there was something almost familiar about the way he stood, patient, watchful, ready, like the handlers Victor remembered from before everything changed. And then, just feet from his target, Victor stopped, dead still, front paws planted firmly on the wet stone, chest heaving with exertion. But no growl, no snarl, no continuation of the attack he'd been trained to execute. He simply sat. Kieran felt his breath catch in his throat. This wasn't right. This wasn't what they'd practiced. Victor should have struck by now, should have brought the guard down in a controlled cackle that would send him sprawling while tourists screamed and cameras captured every second. What the hell? He muttered under his breath, thumb pressing the clicker again. Once, twice, 3 sharp signals that Victor had responded to flawlessly hundreds of times before. The dog's ears twitched, but he didn't move, because Lance Corporal Daniel Fra had done something Kieran hadn't anticipated. Without moving his head, without shifting his stance, without breaking the ceremonial posture that had made him such an appealing target, Fra had made the smallest possible adjustment to his right hand. 2 fingers, barely visible beneath his white dress gloves, shifted in a gesture so subtle that anyone not specifically watching for it would have missed it entirely. A downward flick, military working dog hand signal for stand down. Victor knew that signal not from Kieran's months of conditioning, but from whatever training he'd received before being stolen from that contractor facility in Herefordshire. Deep muscle memory, the kind that survives even the most intensive retraining. The Malinois whimpered once, not in fear, but in confusion, 2 sets of commands warring in his head, 2 different authorities claiming his loyalty, and he'd chosen the one that felt familiar. Fra still hadn't moved, still hadn't spoken, still hadn't acknowledged the crowd that was now staring at him with a mixture of shock and growing understanding that something extraordinary had just happened. But when he finally spoke, his voice carried clearly across the courtyard. Who trained him for you? The question wasn't directed at Victor. It was aimed straight at Kieran, cutting through the noise and confusion like a blade. Because no dog trained purely for aggression would respond to military hand signals. No animal conditioned to attack ceremonial guards would choose to sit on command from his intended target, unless he recognized something in that target. Something familiar, something that reminded him of the handlers he'd known before his training was corrupted for someone else's agenda. Kieran took a step backward, his confidence evaporating like morning mist. Victor was supposed to be his weapon, his proof that these guards were nothing special. Instead, the dog had just demonstrated exactly the opposite. Security was moving now. MOD plainclothes officers appearing from their positions around the square, radios crackling with coded reports. The tourists were backing away, giving the scene space, but nobody was running. The moment felt too controlled for panic. measured for chaos, and Kieran suddenly realized that he wasn't the one in control anymore. Maybe he never had been. The mod officers approached with the kind of calm efficiency that comes from years of handling unusual situations without making them worse. No rushing, no shouting, no dramatic gestures that might escalate an already tense moment. The lead officer was mid-40s, plain clothes, but unmistakably military in his bearing. He kept his hands visible, his movements deliberate, his voice low, enough that tourists couldn't overhear, but clear enough that Kieran understood every word. "Sir, I need you to step away from the dog slowly and deliberately." Kieran looked around frantically, searching for some way to salvage the situation. Victor was still sitting exactly where he'd stopped, close enough to the guard that they could have been posing for a photograph, close enough that it should have been obvious who was supposed to be in control. "He's my dog," Kieran said, his voice louder than he'd intended. "This is just a misunderstanding." The officer didn't respond immediately. Instead, he gestured to his partner, who began moving to flank Kieran's position while remaining far enough away to avoid seeming threatening. "We'll sort that out in a moment," the lead officer said. "Right now I need you to comply with my instructions." That's when they searched him. Professional, thorough, respectful enough that watching tourists couldn't claim they were witnessing police brutality, but comprehensive enough that they found everything. The training clicker in his jacket lining, the meat-scented gloves in his back pocket, the small pouch of high-value treats laced with scent enhancers, designed to trigger aggressive behavior, a folded piece of paper with hand-drawn diagrams showing guard positions around the palace perimeter, and a printed photograph of Victor in full attack posture with handwritten notes about timing, positioning, and escape routes. "Interesting collection," the officer said, holding up the clicker. "Training equipment." Kieran's face was flushed now, his carefully planned composure cracking under the weight of failure. "You don't understand. I trained him for months. He was supposed to attack a ceremonial guard," the officer finished. "Yes, we gathered that." Meanwhile, Lance Corporal Frey had finally broken his rigid posture, not dramatically, not with any flourish that might satisfy the tourists, who were now filming everything, but with the kind of controlled movement that spoke of absolute confidence in his own authority. He knelt beside Victor, one hand extended, palm down in the universal canine greeting. The dog moved toward him without hesitation, pressing his muzzle against Frey's glove in a gesture of recognition and respect. "Hey there, boy," Frey said, quietly. His voice carried the particular tone that experienced handlers use with working dogs, calm, confident, completely without threat. "Someone's been messing with your training, hasn't he?" Victor's tail wagged once, just once, but enough. Frey looked up at the mod officer. "He's got a chip, military working dog, unless I'm mistaken." The officer nodded to his partner, who was already pulling out a handheld scanner. "We'll check that now." "Belgian Malinois, probably 5 or 6 years old," Frey continued, gently examining Victor's ears and muzzle with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done this hundreds of times before. "Look at these scars, professional training marks, and see how he responds to handler contact. He knows what he's supposed to do." The scanner beeped. The officer read the display, and his expression shifted from professional concern to something approaching anger. "Victor, 5 years old, registered to a military contractor in Herefordshire, reported stolen 9 months ago along with 2 other dogs and a transport van." Kieran's mouth opened then closed, his carefully constructed narrative. The months of planning, the patient training, the perfect execution, was falling apart in real time. "You stole him," Frey said. "It wasn't a question. I bought him from someone who stole him." Frey was still kneeling beside Victor, but his voice had taken on an edge that made several tourists step back instinctively. "You bought a military working dog from thieves, spent months trying to turn him into a weapon, and then brought him here to prove some point about ceremonial guards." He stood slowly, Victor moving to sit beside his left leg, as if they'd been partners for years. "The only thing you proved is that you don't understand the first thing about dogs, soldiers, or honor." The crowd had gone completely silent now. Even the children had stopped chattering, sensing that something important was happening even if they couldn't quite understand what. One of the mod officers approached Frey with a leash. "We'll need to take him for evaluation." Frey nodded, then looked down at Victor one more time. "Good boy, you made the right choice." As they led Kieran away, no handcuffs, no dramatics, just professional escort toward an unmarked vehicle. He called out one last time, "He was mine, I trained him. This isn't how it was supposed to happen." Victor turned his head slightly at the sound of his former handler's voice. then looked away. The crowd began to disperse slowly, quietly, like people leaving a funeral. Rather than a tourist attraction, they'd witnessed something they couldn't quite name. Not violence, not drama, but something deeper. Something about choices and loyalty, and the difference between training and trust. Many lingered. Phones lowered now, speaking in hushed tones about what they'd just seen. An elderly man with a remembrance poppy on his coat lapel spoke to his grandson. That guard never moved, lad. Never flinched. But he stopped that attack with nothing more than his presence. A young mother explained to her confused daughter. The dog chose to listen to the right person. Sweetheart, sometimes that's the bravest thing you can do. The word was already spreading through social media, but not in the way Kieran had intended. Instead of a viral video showing ceremonial guards being humiliated, the clips showed something entirely different. A soldier's quiet competence, a dog's moment of moral clarity, the power of choosing respect over revenge. Someone had captured the exact moment Victor sat down, the instant when months of conditioning gave way to deeper instincts. The image would be shared thousands of times, but always with captions about choicey, about doing what's right, even when it's difficult, about the bonds that connect those who serve. A few tourists approached the rope barrier where Fra had resumed his position, phones raised, but held respectfully, as if asking permission rather than simply taking what they wanted. "Excuse me," an elderly woman said softly. "That was remarkable. How did you know what to do?" Fra didn't break his ceremonial posture, but his voice carried clearly. The dog knew what to do. I just reminded him. Later that afternoon, after providing his statement to investigators and watching Victor be led away by MOD handlers, who promised to keep him informed about the dog's evaluation, for return to his post outside Buckingham Palace. The tourists were different now, quieter, more respectful. Word had spread through social media and news reports about the guard who'd stopped an attack, without throwing a punch, drawing a weapon, or even raising his voice. The videos were already circulating. Shaky phone footage of Victor's aborted charge, of Fra's subtle hand signal, of the moment when a trained attack dog chose to trust a stranger over the man who'd spent months conditioning him for violence. But the most powerful moment, the one that would be shared thousands of times and analyzed in military training courses for years to come, was the simplest: a guard kneeling beside a confused dog, offering comfort instead of judgment, a soldier who understood that the real enemy wasn't the animal who'd been stolen and corrupted, but the man who tried to use him as a weapon. 3 days later, Victor passed his behavioral evaluation. The military psychologists concluded that his core training remained intact. Beneath the conditioning Kieran had attempted to overlay, he was still a working dog, still capable of the loyalty and intelligence that had made him valuable to the military contractor before his theft. But the evaluation revealed more than just psychological resilience. Victor had been malnourished when he was stolen, his weight dropping 15 pounds below optimal during his months with Kieran. The scars Fra had noticed weren't just from training. Some were from the restraints and shock collars Kieran had used. When traditional conditioning methods failed, the veterinary team found evidence of stress-related behaviors that would take months to fully resolve. Yet through it all, Victor had retained something essential, something that made him sit when he should have attacked, listen when he should have ignored, choose trust over the fear that had been beaten into him. "It's remarkable," the lead veterinarian told Fra during one of his visits to the rehabilitation facility. "Most dogs subjected to this kind of conditioning would be aggressive for life, but he's responding to positive reinforcement, like he remembers what it feels like to be valued rather than used." The question was what to do with him next. That's when Lance Corporal Daniel Fra submitted a formal request through his chain of command, not for Victor to be reassigned to active duty, the dog's recent history made that impossible, but for authorization to serve as his civilian handler under a rehabilitation program that would allow Victor to live out his remaining years with someone who understood his background and training. The request was approved within 24 hours. A week later, Fra was back at his post outside Buckingham Palace when he heard familiar footsteps behind him. Not the random shuffle of tourist feet, but the controlled patting of trained paws. Victor appeared at his left side, wearing a simple collar instead of a tactical harness, a standard leash instead of the modified equipment Kieran had used. His coat had been groomed, his bearing was relaxed, and his eyes held the kind of contentment that comes from knowing exactly where you belong. And Maud Liaison approached with a folder under his arm and a slight smile on his face. "All the paperwork's complete," he said quietly. "He's officially retired from active service. but he's authorized to remain with his designated handler during off-duty hours, for nodded once, accepting the leash. He can't be here during ceremonial duties, the liaison continued. But otherwise he's yours, Victor said without being commanded, positioning himself just behind Fur's left heel in the way military working. Dogs are trained to stay out of their handler's way while remaining ready to respond to orders. He knows, Fur said softly, knows where home is. As the liaison walked away, tourists began to notice the dog. A few raised phones, others whispered among themselves. But there was something different about their attention now, less curiosity, more respect. They'd heard the story. They knew what Victor represented, not a weapon that had been turned against authority, but a soldier who'd found his way back to the right side. A little girl approached the rope barrier with her father, pointing at Victor with the kind of wonder children reserve for things they can't quite understand, but know are important. Daddy, is that the dog from the video? Her father nodded. That's him. Why is he sitting so still? Because he's learned the difference between following orders and making choices. She considered this for a moment, then looked up at Fra, who remained motionless in his ceremonial position. Are they friends now? Yes, her father said. I think they are. As the afternoon light began to fade over London, casting long shadows across the palace courtyard, Lance Corporal Daniel Fra maintained his silent vigil. Beside him, Victor sat equally still, equally patient, equally focused on a duty that had nothing to do with violence and everything to do with trust. Two soldiers, different species, different backgrounds, different paths to the same understanding. Some bonds can't be broken by theft or corruption or months of misdirected training. Some loyalties run deeper than conditioning. And sometimes, the most powerful response to someone trying to make you into a weapon is simply refusing to be anything other than what you truly are. Have you ever seen an animal choose loyalty over conditioning? Do you think second chances matter more for people or for the animals? Who trust them? And what would you have done in Corporal Fr's place when that dog was charging toward him? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one. And these conversations matter more than you might think. If this story showed you something new about trust, choices, and the bonds between soldiers, both human and canine, hit that like button and let us know. Subscribe and ring that notification bell so you never miss our daily stories about the remarkable individuals who guard these ancient traditions. And if you know someone who still thinks ceremonial guards are just for show, someone who believes respect has to be demanded rather than earned, share this video with them. They might learn something about what real strength looks like. Your next Royal Guard story is waiting on your screen right now. Click it and we'll see you tomorrow with another moment that proves the same truth again and again. The most powerful victories aren't won with force, but with the quiet confidence that comes from knowing exactly who you are and refusing to be anything less.